Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm Andrew Shaner, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Daniel Fessler. He's professor of anthropology, director of the UCLA Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, and the 2018 recipient of the UCLA Gold Shield Faculty Prize for Excellence in Teaching and Research. I've been asked to add a personal dimension, which I think is a good idea because Dr. Fessler is in the business of dissecting human emotions, especially those that support or undermine human cooperation. And he's so methodical and precise about it that you might get the impression that he is coldly scientific. Not so. He's exceptionally kind and generous in his professional life and in his personal life. I get to see this quite a bit because on most Thursday nights, Dan and I join a small band of mountain bike riders to careen through the Santa Monica Mountains at night. And Dan is always sharing snacks, technical advice, tools, and stories, generally seeking to keep us all safe. For example, the rides often end with a steep, tricky descent. And before those, Dan often shouts, "Watch out for rappelling syndrome." Riders new to our group always say, "What's that?" And Dan explains his near-death experience, not mountain bike riding, but rock climbing many years ago. He had reached the top of a difficult climb and relaxed, pushed off the face to enjoy the exhilaration of rappelling down to the bottom. But only at the last second did he realize he didn't have enough rope to reach the bottom. And still dozens of feet in the air, he noticed the end of the rope rushing up to meet him. He grabbed it just as it rushed through the carabiner holding the rope to his harness. And dangling from there, I think he coined the term rappelling syndrome, which refers to the premature sense of safety just before the end of a difficult journey. And it also applies to our descents at the end of a ride. So by shouting out, "Watch out for rappelling syndrome," he is sharing very useful knowledge that he learned the hard way. And this is an important part of human cooperation. A few months ago, I noticed that it was not Dan, but another rider who shouted, "Watch out for rappelling syndrome." So Dan's concern for our safety and one of his methods of promoting it has been encoded in our little culture, which is another key to human cooperation. Also, Dan loves dogs. On a recent hike, he carried the oldest of his 3 dogs. The dog is now blind. Carried that dog across numerous stream crossings so that the dog could continue to enjoy the outdoors. And he greeted other dog walkers, reserving special attention for their dogs. So please join me in welcoming Uber cooperator Dan Fessler.
Thank you, Dr. Shaner, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. He didn't mention that giving advice and following it aren't the same thing, so I often draw on his medical knowledge on those descents, not for others, but for myself. And I'll try not to commit rappelling syndrome in the Q&A, but we'll see what happens. So today I'd like to talk to you about a variety of different topics that I and my colleagues have worked on that I think have some potential messages for clinicians in terms of contemporary mental health. And I'm going to start at the beginning. Forgive me if for some of you this is review. I'm not sure how familiar people are with my general worldview and that of my field. So I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. I try and understand contemporary human health and behavior in light of the evolutionary history of our species, and in particular by understanding how the body and the mind are both composed of a variety of different adaptations, traits produced by natural selection. And in discussing the mind, people often use the metaphor of a computer to describe how the mind operates. People say, oh, she's got a really good CPU, she's really smart, things like that. This is actually a very bad metaphor because a computer is a general purpose information processing system. It has one information processor and different programs all run on that same platform. But in fact, that's not the way that natural selection produces any constellation of traits, be they morphological or psychological. Instead, a better metaphor is a Swiss Army knife, which is a collection of special purpose tools, each of which solves a particular problem. So the corkscrew is good at pulling corks out of wine bottles, but you can't pull slivers out of your heel with it. You can't cut cheese with it. That's all it does. It's a special purpose tool. And natural selection produces adaptations, that is, traits that solve particular classes of adaptive challenges that recurrently confront an organism in the environment in which it evolved. That particular adaptation is completely independent of other adaptations. So for example, I was shopping at Costco one day, and an elderly blue-haired lady asked the tattooed and pierced cashier, she said, "Excuse me, sir, where's your honey?" And he said, "She's at home, where's yours?" Okay? Now, obviously we use food as a source domain for metaphors about sexual attraction, right? Those are entirely different adaptive problems. And if you don't understand the difference between those two and don't recognize that as a metaphor, then you'll be, lonely, certainly hungry, possibly, and unsuccessful in general, right? These are each particular classes of adaptive problems with particular kinds of solutions to them. A second important principle in understanding how adaptations evolve is what we call the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And what we mean here is the constellation of selective pressures, the features of the physical, social, and technological environment that favor a particular solution to a class of problems. And sometimes this is cartoonishly reified as being the Pleistocene environment in which our species lived for a long time as hunters and gatherers. It really depends on the trait that we're talking about. So if we're talking about the human visual system, we are descended from partially frugivorous diurnal primates. The features of photons traveling through the world haven't changed for millions and millions of years. Our visual system and that of the last common ancestor with chimpanzees more than 6 million years ago is certainly the same. So the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness for our visual system is a constant and very old one. In contrast, if we look at, for example, alcohol dehydrogenase, the ability to metabolize alcohol, that is a function of a history of agriculture in which grain products were fermented. Some populations have that history, some do not. Agriculture is only about 10 to 15,000 years old. And so the environment for evolutionary adaptiveness for that particular trait is much shorter than that for visual features. And a crucial feature of understanding behavior and health in light of evolution is that environments can change. And if they change faster than selection has produced modifications of the relevant traits, then we get what's called evolutionary disequilibrium. That is, left to its own devices, selection would continue to operate under those circumstances to modify the trait to fit the new environment. And critically, ours is, of course, a cultural species. We have evidence going back some millions of years that technologically cultural creatures even long predated us. And cultural evolution can happen much more quickly than biological evolution. We're all witnesses to that right now, right? Just in the course of our lifetimes, we've seen enormous changes in social organization, in technology, and so on. And because culture can change more quickly than natural selection can modify organisms in an environment, many features of contemporary health reveal evolutionary disequilibrium. That is, we are poorly adapted to the environment in which we live. And these are just a few examples right here. So on the left, you see a chart from the CDC of prevalence of self-reported obesity in the United States by state. Virtually everywhere Americans are obese. The nationwide prevalence is over a third, right? This will not only greatly increase morbidity and mortality in the years to come, but will eventually bankrupt our economy if we don't come up with a solution to it. Why does this happen? And the answer is very simple. Our ancestors couldn't supersize, right? That is, we have the tastes of a species that had to burn calories in order to obtain calories. Fat has twice the caloric density of protein. Sweetness is a good cue of high calorie content. You combine that with salt, a rare mineral, and you have the McDonald's diet, right, which is just fat, salt, and sugar combined in various different ratios. And we like all of that, and we have no set point that says we've had enough now. Okay? More is always better with regard to our taste preferences, and that one consequence of this is serious problems with obesity. On the right, you see perhaps a familiar figure of addictive substances and the harm that they do. All of these are evolutionarily novel. They're all created through technology. Everything from tobacco to heroin, of course, all products of technology, synthetic alkaloids, all the same, right? And these drugs all stimulate mechanisms that evolve for other purposes. And because of that, they pose substantial dangers because we're not equipped to stop the reward systems that they're taking advantage of. So these are just a few examples of evolutionary disequilibrium. This is really, I think, a fundamental theme through many of the health challenges that we face today. So let me now turn to some psychological issues, and let me start with the observation that the fears that people report, so this is subclinical, these are not patients suffering from psychiatric disease. This is just a poll of the kinds of things that people report being afraid of. These data come from the UK, but the United States looks very similar. If you can't, you guys can read that in the back, okay? Yeah, okay. So fear of heights is the most common in British population, right? It's hard to know exactly how dangerous heights are in our contemporary world because, so Dr. Shaner mentioned rock climbing, but very few of us, unless you're a tree trimmer or a roofer or a rock climber, you're not actually exposed to the dangers of heights very much, and yet everyone reports being afraid of these. Well, not everyone, but over half the population. Snakes. Snakes are not a big problem. Poisonous snakes not a big problem in the United Kingdom, and yet a substantial fraction of the population reports being afraid of snakes. Public speaking. One that might be familiar to many of you, right? Public speaking is really, fear of public speaking is really just a form of fear of negative social evaluation. It's just a particularly strong stimulus for that, okay? Spiders, way up there. Again, poisonous spider is not actually a big problem in the UK, but many people report being afraid of them. Being in enclosed spaces. What we're seeing here is that these are problems that our ancestors confronted, okay? But they are not problems that are really significant in the contemporary environment. So here are preventable causes of death in the US. There's tobacco smoking on the left, obesity and overweight, alcohol, and so on. The little yellow box on the right is because I had to update these data. These are 2000 data, and I had to update them since about 70,000 Americans now die of opioid addiction and overdose every year, right? But still, you don't see snakes on there. Right? The CDC reports that about 7 Americans die of snake bite every year, about 5 of spider bites. It's a little more difficult to collect data on, from published materials on fatal falls, but in work-related accidents where most fatal falls occur, it's less than 1,000 per year. Okay? So the things that people are afraid of, right? They're afraid of falling, they're afraid of snakes, they're afraid of spiders, they're afraid of negative social evaluation. Those are not the things that are killing us today. And this is because of evolutionary disequilibrium. Snakes, spiders, falling from a height, these were things that our ancestors had to worry about a lot, but that we do not. Now, turning to the clinical context, one way of understanding some psychopathologies, by no means all psychopathologies, but some psychopathologies, is that they are hyperactive adaptations. That is, these are mechanisms that were produced by natural selection that are malfunctioning, often by working to extreme. So I've just highlighted for you, these are prevalence rates of different psychopathologies in the United States. I've highlighted for you the top 2. The second one there is social phobia. So recall fear of public speaking in that subclinical British sample, right? A social phobia is essentially a manifestation of the fact that in the world of our ancestors, other people were both an important resource and an important threat, right? Cooperating with others yielded enormous returns, but others were also the principal source of conflict. Intergroup violence is a long-standing part of our species history and long predates our species, as we can see in the archaeological record. So being afraid of other people is understandable in light of that history, and this pathology is just an exaggeration of that fear. The top one there is specific phobias. And specific phobias is really a catch-all term. If we expand that out, you can see by prevalence there's crowds, again, fear of other people, right? But then we also have storms, so another source of mortality among our ancestors. Blood injury injection phobia. So you can think of this as just things piercing the body being problematic. They would have been problematic for our ancestors. Fear of flying is high up there. Fear of flying is really a perfect storm of several fears, because there's the fear of heights and the fear of enclosed spaces, and for some people the fear of crowds, all happening at the same time, right? And then as we go down, we see there's enclosed spaces, there's fear of heights again, right? I used to teach rock climbing, and I can tell you it's very, very hard for the average person to even get more than 10 feet off the ground. Okay? They get very, very frightened very easily. And telling them that, you know, a nylon rope the diameter of your thumb can lift a truck doesn't reassure them. Some of you might be familiar with the Native American reservation on the Grand Canyon, where they built a tourist attraction that's a giant plexiglass horseshoe that goes out over the Grand Canyon. For $60, you can walk out on that horseshoe. They have a no refund policy, and the reason they have that is because people very often get to the edge and say, I can't do it, I want my money back. Okay? Telling them that it is completely over-engineered, it can support thousands of people, you are in no danger of falling, doesn't make any difference, because this is a particular blade in that Swiss Army knife that does one thing, and that's to warn you of the danger of falling from a height in a world where there weren't technologies like nylon ropes or plexiglass that could protect us. Okay? Down there at the bottom, we have the most common catch-all category is fear of insects, snakes, and animals, all things that were quite dangerous for our ancestors. And I want to now turn to some research that we've done highlighting the insect category in particular. Across all vertebrates, ectoparasites, that is, organisms that prey on their host from the outside of the body, are a significant source of selective pressure. And in response to this, we see in the animal literature the development of a whole suite of specialized behavioral adaptations to combat the threat of ectoparasites. And my collaborator and I postulate that exactly the same kinds of adaptations should exist in humans. We know that ectoparasites are a significant source of selective pressure on non-human primates and on humans even today, right? So blood loss is one factor, but importantly also ectoparasites are vectors for a wide variety of diseases ranging from malaria, yellow fever, leptospirosis, and on, right? Many of these problems arise this way. And importantly, students of animal behavior have shown that there are two different classes of behavioral adaptations that are defenses against ectoparasites, called stimulus-response grooming behaviors and programmed grooming behaviors. Just looking at those pictures, some of you might start to feel a little bit itchy. In fact, I see some of you rubbing your appendages. Okay? So stimulus-response grooming is essentially scratching an itch. That is, visually or tactily identifying the presence of an ectoparasite and responding by trying to remove it. Okay? So your dog is walking along and then all of a sudden just stops and scratches vociferously at one particular point, right? That is a stimulus response grooming behavior. Okay? It is complemented, those kinds of behaviors are complemented by programmed grooming. So if you have a cat, you're already familiar with this. Your cat might never leave your house, has no fleas, has never been exposed to ectoparasites, and yet every day your cat spends hours grooming itself. Okay? Animals have stereotypical grooming patterns. They're often circadian timed. And importantly, they're also seasonally timed, so that it's springtime now. Those of you who enjoy the Santa Monica Mountains, like Dr. Shana and I do, know that the ticks are out in force after a wet winter. The deer actually upregulate their programmed grooming in response to increases in photoperiod, that is the length of the day, in anticipation of the hatching of the ticks. So they start grooming more before the ticks have even arrived, because they have a specialized blade in their Swiss Army knife of mental adaptations that is only about preventing ectoparasite reduction in fitness through increased grooming. Okay? And these mechanisms are incredibly fine-tuned so that, for example, smaller animals which have a larger surface area to internal volume ratio, and as a consequence, every bite is more costly for a smaller animal than for a larger animal. Both across and within species, smaller animals spend a greater proportion of their day in programmed grooming. That is, they are increasing their defenses in response to the costs that would be inflicted on them. Okay. So we think that this is a useful template for organizing a variety of aspects of human experience, including psychopathology. So let's turn first to, you'll recall that I said that insects, snakes, and animals are among the most common of the specific phobias. And insect phobia, sometimes called entomophobia, is what I want to talk about right now. So these are bed bugs parasitizing a human host. And I want you to reflect for just a moment on the emotional experience that you have looking at this. Okay? So when we poll people, the term that they use to describe their emotion most commonly is disgust. Okay? Well, I've worked quite a lot on disgust, so let's pause for a moment and think about disgust before we come back to defenses against ectoparasites, right? So disgust is prominent in not only entomophobia, but significantly in obsessive-compulsive disorders. Now, interestingly, the classical elicitors of disgust are accused of the presence of pathogens. So if you look at these two photographs here, overwhelmingly people report that the photograph on the left is more disgusting than the photograph on the right. Okay? Both of these are just plates full of paint, right? But the photograph on the left has the coloration and distribution of some sort of unspecified human body product, right? This could be diarrhea, this could be vomit, it's not entirely clear, right? Unless you're from Pandora, the photograph on the right doesn't reflect any body product at all, right? And people report that the photograph on the left is more disgusting, consistent with disgust being part of a mechanism that is guarding against pathogens, not against ectoparasites, right? And this is consistent with the disgust response, which typically involves gastrointestinal distress, a loss of appetite, a desire not to bring things close to the mouth, right? And of course, the oral pathway is a principal pathway for pathogens to enter the body because of oral tolerance, among other things, right? So this looks like disgust responses are more consistent with patterns like obsessive-compulsive disorder, in which people are very concerned about hygiene and contamination, ideas that are relevant to pathogens but not particularly relevant to ectoparasites. So how can we explain what's going on here? In order to do so, I need to back up to some research that I did with a graduate student years ago. And we reasoned that if disgust is an adaptation guarding the body against pathogens, right, then it should be the case that the interface of the body is particularly sensitive to disgust. That is, it's the places where the body interacts with the environment where pathogens can be contracted, and therefore, if people experience disgust differentially across different parts of their body, those parts of their body that interface with the environment should be more disgust sensitive than those that do not. So we have a basic inside the body versus outside the body distinction, right? And then in particular, those parts that are portals, orifices, for example, they should be particularly disgust sensitive. So in order to test this hypothesis, we presented participants with a hypothetical organ transplant paradigm, where we said medical science has advanced to the point that we can take cells from you, grow them in a laboratory into any organ that you need to have replaced, and this will extend your health and longevity. How disgusting would it be to have various body parts replaced? And remember, it's your own cells, so there's no contamination from another party, because that's a potential confound. And the zigzag pattern that you see here, I'll walk you through it quickly, but essentially that's basically inside the body versus outside the body. The blue line is men and the pink line is women. There's a robust pattern across many, many studies of women being slightly more disgust sensitive than men. That's a separate topic that I can address later if you're interested. Right, so on the left we have how disgusting would it be, this is a 4-point scale, to have a lung transplant. People say, a little bit, but not so much. How about a foot transplant? That would be a bit more disgusting. This is your tax dollars at work right here, people, okay? How about a heart transplant? That doesn't bother me so much. Right? How about a finger transplant? Oh, that bothers me more, right? A liver transplant doesn't bother me so much. An anus transplant? Oh, that bothers me a lot. Okay, this is an orifice, right? Now remember, it's your own cells, so it's not somebody else's, it's not a pre-owned anus that we're talking about here, okay? A bicep, it doesn't bother me. A nasal passage, that bothers me more. Spleen, I'm not really sure where that is, but I'll take a new one if I need it. Tongue, that would bother me a lot, okay? Right? And so, and the other high point there, if you're wondering, is genitals, right? So these are all parts of the body that interface with the environment. People think that would be more disgusting to somehow have that part of the body changed, right? That is, disgust is concentrated on the interface between the body and the environment, and orifices have special salience because that's a pathway in for pathogens, right? So now we can go back to this question of the relationship between pathogen avoidance and ectoparasite avoidance, and what these two task domains share is the need to guard the surface, right? Now, for pathogens, the portals are particularly important, but the surface in general is important. For ectoparasites, it's just the surface, okay? So what this suggests is that there are shared features of the task demands that lead to a shared solution, but the details of those solutions are different in that, putting things into your mouth isn't a problem when it comes to ticks or leeches. It is a problem when it comes to E. coli, for example. Okay? So, and these are data that are hot off the press. Well, not even off the press. We haven't written the paper yet. But what we did is we showed participants, these are Mechanical Turk workers, so online participants. We showed them a wide variety of videos of classical pathogen eliciting disgust stimuli, so overflowing toilets, rotting food, and so on, right? Or ectoparasites, so ticks, leeches, mosquitoes, and so on. And then we asked them to report their somatic symptoms. And what you see here is that this is a factor analysis. I apologize for not having more detailed information, but as I said, we just finished collecting these data, right? What you see here is that when it comes to those cues of the presence of pathogens like body products, putrefaction, and so on, there people report gastrointestinal distress, right? A desire to decontaminate themselves, to wash, and so on, right? They certainly don't want to eat. But when they're exposed to cues of ectoparasites, they report tactile sensations. They feel itchy, they want to scratch, they feel creepy crawly things moving across their skin, they feel goosebumps. We think goosebumps, this is a defense against ectoparasites because piloerection increases the regional specificity of the stimulus. You can detect more carefully where a flea or a tick moving across you is when your fur is erect, as it were. Okay? So, in fact, what we're seeing is that people say both of these things are disgusting, but they're not the same disgust. Okay? One of these is very much a surface tactile disgust that works well for ectoparasites, and the other is a gastrointestinal rejection disgust that works well to defend against pathogens. Right? So we can understand this in terms of what is sometimes called in neuroscience neuro reuse, wherein when there are mechanisms that share task features, in this case guarding the surface of the body, different adaptations will share some of the neural networks involved in those. And it's often said that natural selection is a tinkerer, not an engineer. It doesn't design systems from scratch. You get these kind of kludgy adaptations that are combinations of traits. So disgust works for both, but they're different kinds of disgust. It works for both because it's guarding the surface of the body. Okay. Let me turn now to another of these stimulus response psychopathologies, that is how we're responding to information about the presence of an ectoparasite. And that's a recently identified condition called trypophobia. My collaborator, Tom Kupfer, wrote his dissertation on this. And this is people having an aversive reaction to the image of small holes, often small holes filled with something, as you see here. These are, those are images from, I believe, it's a lotus seed pod. People are bothered by sponges, toast, and things like this that have many small holes. And what Kupfer has shown is that this is not an accident. Instead, that this is a pattern that is characteristic of a variety of ectoparasite infestations. So here we have, in the center there, that's a scabies infection, highly contagious skin condition. If you remember from when you were a child, and boys or girls, depending on your gender, had cooties. Cooties is the Malay word for scabies. Children often suffer scabies even today in Southeast Asia. The English colonized Malaysia and parts of Indonesia in the 17th century, and that word crept into our language. On the right, you see a patient who's suffering from a severe botfly infestation. Right? These are probably disturbing images to many of you, right? If you're a trypophobe, anything that even remotely resembles these images is disturbing to you. So this is an exaggerated response to historically reliable cues of the presence of ectoparasites in another individual. And obviously you want to avoid close contact with them because they're highly transmissible. Conditions like scabies, extremely easily transmitted. That's where we get the children's game today, right? Okay. A rarer but perhaps more dramatic psychopathology of stimulus response grooming is delusional parasitosis, in which individuals erroneously believe themselves to be infested. They often excoriate their skin. If you follow things on the internet, you might have heard about Morgellons disease. There was such a public outcry about this that the CDC actually launched a special investigative team. There is no Morgellons disease. There is not a single case of individuals who claim that they have Morgellons disease actually having any infection or infestation at all. People, in fact, turn in things like carpet fibers and wool and things like this that they've removed from their bodies, and they're convinced that these are, in fact, ectoparasites. This is an extreme example of the detection mechanism going awry. And very interestingly with this, although it's as I said, it's a rare condition, it's very common for individuals who are in a close relationship, like husband and wife or siblings, to experience the delusion together. Okay, that is, they both believe that they are infested. And if you combine, first of all, the basic fact that ectoparasites move from one host to another, okay, and therefore that individuals who are cohabiting are at risk of transmitting an ectoparasite from one another. And second, that one of the cues of the presence of ectoparasites is a conspecific scratching. So I could have been playing with you the whole time by doing this, and if I kept doing this, you would start doing this too. Scratching is very contagious, and the reason it's very contagious is because if you're near a conspecific who is currently suffering from an ectoparasite, then the chances are that you are at risk yourself, and therefore it pays to upregulate your tactile defenses so that your collar rubbing a little bit, which didn't bother you previously, starts to bother you now when you scratch at it. Okay? So you combine these things, and you can see why it's so common for delusional parasitosis to occur, to be transmitted, as it were, from one cohabiting individual to another. Okay. Finally, and this isn't a psychopathology per se, but might be relevant nonetheless in some of your clinical work. So pruritus, the feeling of itch, increases at night. So somebody who has eczema, for example, will scratch more at night than during the day. And in some individuals, this is so extreme that it can actually disrupt their sleep. Why is pruritus increasing? It's not because the actual underlying condition that's causing the itch changes. Instead, it's that the itch response changes. The reason it does so is the threshold for itch is reduced because one of our defenses against ectoparasites is the tactile detection and then the scratch response in reaction to that. And sleep is the one time when we are particularly vulnerable to ectoparasites because we can't use any of the other cues, like the visual cues, the conspecific's behavior, detecting the tick moving across you, and so on by seeing it. We can't use those cues when we're asleep, and so we upregulate our other defense, which is the itch response. And of course, there's an evolutionary arms race between pathogens and hosts, so those bed bugs that I showed you earlier, they've evolved to specifically target humans when they are asleep because that's when they're most vulnerable. That in turn favors increased upregulation of the itch response. And so pruritus is just a manifestation of this, sometimes for reasons having to do with just simple dermatological conditions. Okay. Now let me turn to the other category, which is programmed grooming. Okay, remember what your cat does every day. And here we think that we can make sense of things like hair pulling, skin picking, nail biting, various surface damaging syndromes in which individuals remove parts of their body, right? We can think of these as extreme versions of normal programmed grooming, okay? So unlike the delusional parasitosis, right, unlike entomophobia, here individuals are not responding to a specific detection of an infection or infestation. Instead, there's something about the surface of their bodies that bothers them, and they experience tension in anticipation of trying to correct that surface problem. Okay? Your cat does the same thing when she's grooming. And in fact, cats suffer from, dogs, many domestic animals, birds, suffer from essentially a veterinary version of these disorders. It's called acral lick disorder in dogs and cats, where they lick themselves until they've removed all their fur, and then they start to actually excoriate their skin, right? They're over-grooming themselves. Hair-pulling disorders are of the same type. People are very, very bothered by what they call crazy hairs, a hair that's out of place. Got to pull that crazy hair. Oh, okay, feel much better now that I've pulled that crazy hair out, okay? Importantly, as I said, this is tension reducing, okay, which is very different than that, I've got to get it, scratch it, right, get rid of it. There's something right there. It hurts me, it's bothering me, I need to get rid of it, okay, or I'm disgusted by it, okay. So we can draw some provisional clinical implications from these. First, it should be the case that comorbidities occur within rather than across these two classes of disorders. So we would expect that an individual who has hair-pulling disorder is at risk of skin-picking disorder, for example, but not at risk of entomophobia. Second, there are going to be, we think, two different clinical responses that are going to be efficacious. So for stimulus response problems, habituation and desensitization are going to be important, right? The way to get people to stop being afraid of insects is to just repeatedly expose them to insects in a safe environment to where they stop having that response, okay? When I say afraid, it's really disgust of this special kind. And conversely, for program grooming, things like stress management, managing anxiety pharmacologically and through psychotherapy are going to be important, because this is tension reducing for patients, right? So trying to minimize the tension that they experience is going to be more helpful. And we don't know. This is work that we're doing right now. We think that those program grooming conditions may be on a circadian clock where they're exacerbated in the evening, because all primates groom just before sleep. Humans clearly do this as well. It's hard to explain, brushing your hair and your teeth and washing your face before you go to sleep in terms of any kind of impression management or social presentation, right? Because you're going to bed. Your hair's going to get messed up before you get up, right? So why do we all, this is a good time to do this. And I worked in rural Indonesia for many years. People do exactly the same thing, right? They groom themselves right before going to sleep. This is when primates groom themselves extensively. It's a good use of their time when they need to be in a roost where it's safe from predators. They're not foraging anymore, and they're often near conspecifics who can help groom them. Okay. So with that as sort of one example of our approach, let me turn now to an entirely different topic, and that's bereavement. Okay. Another topic that I've worked on. So bereavement is a ubiquitous experience. Everyone who lives long enough will eventually experience bereavement. Those of you who've had this experience know that it can be quite debilitating. And really the clinical criteria for pathological bereavement are simply a matter of duration. Right? It's just that bereavement extends beyond 6 months. Well, if you think about it, if we had any kind of debilitating condition that lasted up to 6 months, other than this, that is, if it wasn't just that everyone had this experience, you'd say, well, that's kind of problematic, right? People are quite debilitated for 6 months, but they're normal, and then if it goes beyond 6 months, and now there's a clinical problem, right? Functional impairment is quite significant frequently. And in order to try and understand what's going on here, and bereavement is complicated, I'm only going to talk about one facet of it, I want to draw your attention to the cognitive component, which my collaborator Claire White and I describe as changing your representation of a valued relationship partner from that of an agent who has fitness benefits that they can offer you to a non-agent who is no longer able to participate in those cooperative interactions, right? And this is characterized by what people in signal detection theory sometimes call the smoke detector principle, what in this field is called the error management principle, which is that natural selection designs adaptations when they can't have perfect detection, and therefore there are two kinds of errors that might be made, to make the least costly error. So if you're walking through the woods and you see something squiggly on the ground, right, there are two possibilities. Either that is a snake or it's not a snake, and there are two kinds of errors you might make. right? You might jump when it isn't a snake, or you might fail to jump when it is a snake. One of those errors is more costly than the other, right? In this case, the false negative is more costly than the false positive. Well, many systems exhibit error management design of this kind. The smoke detector in your house, for example, goes off when you burn the toast, and it's designed that way so that it will always go off when the house is on fire, because the first mistake is more costly than failing to go off when your house is on fire. Well, if you think about it, in the world of our ancestors, people went away, right? They went off hunting, they went to see family. There was no cell phone communication. It was unclear whether they were coming back or not, okay? So the missing relationship partner is a problem in terms of error management. Is the person, have I lost that relationship, or is that relationship returning? Even just an individual who is immobile potentially presents this problem, right? Are they dead, or are they just sleeping, right? There are two kinds of mistakes that you can make here. One of those mistakes is more costly than the other. Abandoning a relationship because you think the partner is lost when he or she isn't is much more costly than maintaining the relationship when in fact the partner is deceased. Okay? So this means that there should be a prolongation over time of better safe than sorry as to whether that partner is coming back. And finally, there's fast information processing in which we respond immediately to stimuli, and then there's propositional knowledge, slow information processing. And what we call false recognitions are when bereaved individuals hear or see something that they at first attribute to the deceased, and then they say, oh no, that wasn't her in the kitchen, she's dead. Okay? And many people have this experience. Well, we hypothesize that the contemporary environment presents people with cues that are not reliable in this regard, right? And that the psychology should be attuned to ecologically valid cues with this error management principle at work. So let me walk you through what we did. And we tested in 2 different studies. We used bereaved pet owners. And the reason we used pet owners is because there aren't cultural mores about how you should experience grief when your beloved dog or cat dies. And also because people have more direct experience with the death of a pet than they do often with the death of a human loved one. Okay? So the first is that individuals who are frequently exposed to photographs or videos of the deceased pet should experience false recognitions. They hear a sound in the other room, they think that's the cat, and then they remember the cat's dead. Okay? They should experience those more than people who don't have the same exposure to photographs and videos. Because those photographs and videos are a false cue, they weren't part of the world of our ancestors. Remember evolutionary disequilibrium. And so the exposure to those visual images maintains the representation of the agent as present, and therefore for a longer period of time people have this symptom of bereavement that is false recognition. And that's what we find, okay? And we find this even after controlling for attachment to the pet. So it isn't the case that people who love the pet more look at photographs of the pet more and therefore experience more grief. It's simply exposure to the photographs prolongs their bereavement, okay? Conversely, it should also be the case that exposure to a badly injured or dismembered body is an ecologically valid cue of the death of the individual, right? In contrast, an intact but immobile body is an ambiguous cue. Is that individual asleep or are they actually dead? Okay? This is one place where working with pet owners is very advantageous because many pet owners, the pet is euthanized by the veterinarian. It appears to go to sleep. Other pet owners see, for example, their dog hit by a car. Okay? And we can poll the pet owners and ask them about their experience of the body of the pet at the time of the pet's death. And what we find is that those who were exposed to non-intact corpses of the pets experience less duration and lower frequency of false recognition than those who either the pet just went away at the veterinarian, the veterinarian euthanized the animal and they never saw the body, or they were with the body but it was just an immobile and intact body. So exposure to the non-intact corpse is an ecologically valid cue that truncates, it shortens bereavement. Next, we looked at mortuary and funerary practices around the world in a representative collection of the world's cultures. And what we find is that in the vast majority of cultures, family members have some contact with the corpse. Okay? And at the lowest level of contact there that you see on the left, what we call low intimate, they just touch and handle the corpse. In the intermediate category, they may kiss and embrace the corpse. And in the high category, they may have very, very intimate contact, for example, removing organs and so on. Okay? Why is it that the world's cultures basically have mortuary rituals in which the family members have direct contact? The overwhelming majority of the world's cultures have rituals in which the family members have direct contact with the corpse. We think that the reason is simply because handling an immobile, cold, rigid body is an ecologically valid cue of death, and therefore these rituals are actually ameliorative when it comes to bereavement. It's not that they eliminate bereavement, but they shorten it. Okay? So from this, there's some pretty clear, I think, clinical implications. We should call these provisional, because these are only a few studies. It's not definitive, but a family member should be actively involved in the dying process of a patient, right? There should be a way to encourage and create an environment in which they can interact with the deceased's remains. And conventional wisdom in bereavement treatment, in which individuals are encouraged to memorialize the deceased, is probably misguided. So if we pause for just a moment and think about death and dying in the United States today, right? Overwhelmingly, individuals die in a medical setting, often removed from family members. Well-meaning healthcare providers often tell family members to stay away because they think that it will be disturbing for family members, right? And then following death, we have professionals whose job it is to simulate life in the deceased, right? So they pump bodies full of preservatives and they dress them up. And what do people always say at these open casket funerals, right? She looks like she's sleeping, right? Okay, that is, the goal is to create the simulacrum of life, ideally from the perspective of well-meaning morticians, to minimize bereavement, but in fact this is probably greatly exaggerating bereavement. And now, of course, with electronic technology, we have photographs and videos on steroids. We have websites in which you can go every day in perpetuity and see videos of your interactions with a deceased loved one, right? I think all of this is profoundly misguided. I think this is potentially really, really increasing the burden of bereavement, and it's an experience that everyone is going to have. Okay? Now, I'm cognizant of time, and I had hoped to also talk to you about work that we've done on contagious prosociality. I can give you the short version of that, which is that being exposed to other people behaving in a very prosocial way makes people feel good and makes them motivated to behave prosocially. The Mattel Children's Hospital thinks that my postdoc, Adam Sparks, is a generous philanthropist, and they're constantly inviting him to dinners and such. And the reason is because he has written checks for thousands of dollars to the Children's Hospital. Those checks are actually the participant fees that our participants have returned to us in experiments in which we show people prosocial behavior and then give them the opportunity to donate a portion of their participation fee. People are giving back more money than we are paying them, and we're donating that money to the hospital. This is contagious prosociality. Okay? I present this to you because obviously prosociality and its antithesis, self-interested antisocial behavior, is extremely problematic in our current society. Arguably, over the last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic rise in it in the public, political sphere, but overall, anybody who drives in traffic in Los Angeles has had the experience of plenty of antisociality around us, right? And you might ask, well, what does this have to do with the clinic? And I'm skipping all the experimental results. We have 17 studies, all showing more or less the same thing, which is that prosociality is contagious. And here I just want to highlight work that is really captained by Dr. Shaner and colleagues over at the VA, and that is, and I play a very minor part in this, I'm simply kind of a peripheral advisor, right? Here the question is, how can we use some of these ideas from evolutionary psychology to create a more positive, caring, and humanistic environment in interaction between provider and patient, and to reduce provider burnout at the same time. And the goal is to achieve that by understanding the ways that those blades in the Swiss Army knife are responding to patients, right? So an aggressive or unpredictable patient is likely to elicit withdrawal because aggressive people are a threat. right? Signs of infectiousness, right? Even the vast majority of you people are professional clinicians, and I saw you all wince when I showed you a botfly-infested individual, right? That is, it's going to be much harder to approach that individual and be kind and caring with that individual because of your own anti-ectoparasite transmission defense mechanisms, right? And then, of course, anything that suggests that the patient is not a good cooperator, arrogance, malingering, right? Or even simple lack of compliance with provider instructions. All of this leads us to withdraw from cooperative interactions because in our normal everyday interactions and the interactions of our ancestors in small-scale societies, uncooperative people were a source of costs and not benefits. Therefore, you withdraw from interaction with them. Okay? That, of course, is not the role of the provider, and that kind of withdrawal is counterproductive, right? And there are error management features here throughout. So if you're not sure whether that patient is malingering or not, you're inclined to assume that they are because that's the least costly error. So some of the techniques that Dr. Shaner and colleagues have developed in this regard are to try and think about the patient more holistically, right? To put the negative features into context in a way that reduces their acute salience, to consciously enact these warm and prosocial behaviors because prosociality is contagious. It's contagious both with the patient and with colleagues in the clinic, right? And to recognize that, in fact, providers are not in a bilateral cooperative exchange relationship with patients. There is a unidirectional provision of care regardless of the patient's response to that. And your own tendency to withdraw is irrelevant and needs to be countermanded, right? And finally, by really enacting in the break room and in the exam room the prosocial overtures towards others, we create a self-sustaining virtuous cycle of prosocial behavior that makes the clinical experience not only more positive for the patient, but more healing for the patient, and the provision of care more positive for the provider as well. So with that, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I like dogs.
All right, we have time for a question or two.
So UMBA shows many examples of contagion, but your work on contagion of prosociality is very interesting to me for a number of reasons. Is there something special about the contagion and prosociality shows compared to other kinds of contagious behavior?
So the question from Dr. Iacoboni is there something special about prosociality as a contagious phenomena versus other contagious phenomena? So I told you that scratching is contagious, right? Is there something special about it? There are several special things, okay? First of all, and I didn't go into this before, but our work shows that people's prior expectations of others' prosociality is a determinant of how responsive they are. And that's unique to this. So if you walk into a situation expecting others to be self-interested actors, and you see somebody behave in a remarkably prosocial way, you don't experience what is called elevation, which is this positive, uplifting emotion, okay? And you aren't subsequently motivated to behave more prosocially yourself. On the other hand, if you walk into that situation with a prior expectation that others will behave prosocially, then you're susceptible to contagion. And this makes sense in terms of Bayesian updating. That is, you're constantly changing your priors about the world based on experience. What that means is that it's possible to create communities of prosociality in which individuals are increasing their prior expectations of others' prosociality. And it's unique to that. It doesn't, asking how prosocial do you expect others to be only predicts how susceptible to prosocial contagion you are, not to other contagious phenomena. So it's not something about general empathy, it's not something about attention to others, it's not something about, for example, neuroticism or something like that, that we might think just in general as making people more sensitive to social cues. What we call idealism, which is the prior expectation of others' prosociality, is unique in this regard. And so the challenge, of course, is if you have a community of antisocial actors, right, everyone expects everyone else to behave self-interestedly. How do you break into that, right? And we think that part of the answer is when you remove people from that environment, even if only temporarily, they build a separate attitude for a new set of social partners, right? So Dr. Shaner works in a clinic dedicated to homeless veterans, right? Those people are often surrounded by antisocial actors on the street, Right? They're constantly on their guard. But in the clinic, they can be surrounded by prosocial actors. And so they can start to modify their prior expectations in that regard.
So thanks for an excellent presentation. This really clarified a lot. With regard to the itch threshold, does the pain seems to be felt more intensely at night? Is that the same phenomenon at work?
Don't think so. So I'm not an expert on the neurophysiology of itch, but my recollection is that the pathways have been carefully worked out and that they're separate pathways than pain. Okay? And in fact, patients who, for example, have eczema will often excoriate themselves at night when they're asleep in ways that are painful. Okay? So these really seem like separate mechanisms. And the first is, the itch response is explicable in terms of our increased vulnerability to parasitism.
Okay, second question. With regard to obesity, it was my impression that the group at Philadelphia, Beck and his colleagues, that there is a set point of sorts for body weight.
So there are many factors. I simplified a very complicated situation. There are many factors that contribute to obesity. There are genetic differences between individuals that in part operate through that set point. There are important influences of the microbiome. There are physical environmental influences that have nothing to do with caloric abundance, things like pseudoestrogens, synthetic pseudoestrogens in the environment. Laboratory animals today are eating more or less the same diet that they were eating 50 years ago, but they're much more likely to be overweight, okay? And that suggests that there are, contagious components, whether it's in the water, whether it's bacterial microbiome transfer, right? There are things that are shaping obesity more than just the abundance of calories. Because if you have a rat that's on ad lib food, right, then if it wasn't fat 25 years ago and it is fat today, it's not just the availability of the calories that has changed. But it is certainly the case, right, that many of those differences are basically irrelevant in a world where people have to expend calories in order to get calories, right? In contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, of which there are still a few, where people still make a living in the way that our species did for most of its history, there is no obesity. It just doesn't exist, okay? There isn't even anyone who's overweight. You can't be if, in order to get more food, you have to burn energy.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Fessler. Really
Thank you all
appreciate
for your
it.
attention.